The horrors persist, but so does my ability to be silly. Welcome back to the 5th week of Halloween in It's not July anymore. Halloween in August, I guess. I can't use a term that would make sense for this because a certain mouse who loves enforcing its copyright with extreme prejudice might decide to take it personally. Why are we persisting into August this Halloween in July? Well, for one, there were only 4 Saturdays in July this year, and for another, I was expecting to need a whole month to get all my stuff from the big cross-country move, but the movers ended up showing up like 2 days after I did, so I had the time to go the extra mile. Plus, a certain game franchise is about to have its 10th birthday, and given the theme of this year's Halloween in July, I'd be insane not to keep going. Let me give you the lowdown on Halloween in Jugust real quick, since we've already gone over it 4 times. I'm spending the summer with a bunch of spooky games because I can. I've slashed the discount for yearly patronage as low as it'll go over on patreon.com/charlatanwonder because I can. And anyone who takes advantage of that yearly discount gets a cool thank you gift like this anti-content patch or a patron apron at the recipe tier, all while being able to try out the cooking segments this summer and all that good stuff because I can. This year the theme is mascot horror with a twist. I'm going to play through all these games, which for basically all of them, this is my first time playing any of them, using what's called the beginner's mindset. I am going into each of these games with no preconceptions. That means I'm ignoring any and all stigma about mascot horror, but I am also taking the games as they are without any outside theory or lore. Why? Because this is the fairest possible shot I can give to these games, which is frankly something I don't see a lot of in mascot horror. Most people are either trying to pump out a lore video or a reaction as fast as possible, or they're just trying to baselessly dunk on them without giving any sort of fair shot to the games themselves because, haha, these are stupid baby games, I'm so smart with my sick own zones. Don't be like that latter guy. It's just not very nice. Tonight's gonna be a doozy though. We're doing Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. When this game came out, it was a disaster that was only slightly mitigated by some pretty good memes. The fans of the series didn't like it. The lore heads didn't like it, owing to how, without spoiling too much right off the bat, this game does the equivalent of somehow Palpatine has returned, and the hardcore gamer crowd was having a field day to point out all the ridiculous bugs and general issues with gameplay and performance that Security Breach was packing. Now, like I just said, I'm checking all of that at the door, and I'm just going to play the game as it is. However, this one's kind of special, so later in the video I will be taking a step back after we've gone over all the game's features to address some of the context that this game has because this deserves recognition. A lot of things about Security Breach start to make a lot more sense when that information is present. Nobody sets out to make a terrible, near non-functional game. For now though, let's talk about that gameplay. And we're going to start with the most obvious thing that you can immediately see, which is the performance. This game buckles under its own weight, and I see a few reasons for that right off the bat. For one, the game has some pretty big, highly detailed environments. Lots of high ceilings and long hallways with no means of obfuscating the player's line of sight, so you can always see to the far end and like whatever entities are out there. Plus, every major character model has a ton of like moving parts with God knows how many polygons in each model before we even get to the size of the textures on these guys. On that note, though all the pre-done animations during like cutscenes and cinematics look really good and Steel Wool takes full advantage of how expressive these characters can be, for reference, I am running this on a pretty beefy PC. I've got an RTX 3090, which was the biggest, baddest GPU that you could get at the time this game was released. And interestingly enough, while there is a minimum GPU requirement for Security Breach, there is still no recommended graphics card on the Steam page. I've also got a processor with 16 physical cores, and just because last time I tried to talk about performance in regards to a mascot horror game, someone tried to bring this up, I will also say, just for everyone's sanity, I am definitely running this game out of my GPU. My CPU is a dedicated processing unit with no integrated graphics. If I'm not running my displays out of my GPU, I'm getting a black screen. Between this and all the other, frankly, overpowered specs of my recording and editing rig, which is the PC equivalent of like an F250, there is no reason something like this would have issues. If I had to guess, it would seem that Security Breach just can't handle all the stuff that they tried to cram inside of Unreal 4. The game does boast that it has Insta-LOD on the screens you get when you boot it up, but there's only so much that you can do when you're constantly in these massive, colorful rooms with lots of reflective surfaces where you can clearly see from one end of the room to another. My first hour of this game wasn't so much playing it as it was turning on my GPU monitor's on-screen display and seeing where I got the frame drops the worst while playing with all the settings, and by the time I actually got into the Pizzaplex atrium, I had a pretty good idea of what needed to be tweaked so I could play the game with minimal interference from slowdowns and hitching. I figured it out after realizing that my frame rate dropped the hardest whenever I got close to these fancy doors in the meet and greet area. It's the ray tracing. If you're having issues with Security Breach, just turn off the ray tracing and maybe the reflections for good measure. I went from struggling to maintain 30 frames per second to easily hitting my hard limit of 120 FPS basically anywhere in this game just by turning ray tracing off. It's a shame too, because when it was working, Security Breach looked really nice. You could see all the reflections of the cool neon signs and what have you in the mirrored surfaces, and they probably would have been able to get away with it too if they scaled down just how huge some of these areas are to be smaller than your typical Costco warehouse. But as it stands, Steel Wool probably shot themselves in the foot here. It's worth noting that it's totally doable to have nice looking games with big atrium-like areas, with a great example being one of my favorite games, Typhon, also known as Prey 2017. That's on CryEngine though, and came out before real-time ray tracing was a thing for GPUs. One last little side note before we move along on this. This game is 90 gigs unpacked onto my hard drive. That makes Security Breach a hefty boy, nearly twice the size of the Elden Ring base game, and I say base game because as I am writing and recording this, I am in the distant past, and the Elden Ring DLC is not out yet, so I can't attest to how big the game with the DLC is. I am frankly scared of what the Security Breach Switch port looks like, since last I checked, a Switch cartridge for Nintendo tops out at 32 gigabytes. Maybe I should actually talk about the game itself now. You play as Gregory, a little scamp that snuck into the super duper mega pizzaplex and is potentially okay with murder. We first meet Gregory when he's piloting glam rock Freddy like a mech, or perhaps more like an EVA unit, but I'm not the person to ask about lore questions. I'm an outsider to FNaF lore, but I will try my best when it is relevant. Gregory needs to get out of the pizzaplex now, and to do that, he's got to survive until 6 a.m. That's gonna be a bit of a challenge since it seems that everyone but Freddy wants to catch him. Luckily, when Gregory hides inside of Freddy, he's safe from almost everything. Night Guy cares not for your animatronic mech piloting. Surviving until 6 is going to require going from one area to another, getting higher security clearances, and that also means you're going to have to go up against all the other animatronics who are not as kind as Freddy. There's Chica, who aside from some pretty impressive shredding early on, doesn't have much of an arc. Monty Gator, who out of the whole Glamrock crew, I'd put my money on him being the one most likely to throw a TV out of a hotel window. And Roxy, who, I think she's trying to work through some stuff.
Thank you. Your hair is beautiful. Your tail is beautiful. Everyone was watching you. Everyone loves you.
Can animatronics have stage moms? I'm trying my best to think of how to describe what exactly you do in Security Breach, and it boils down to you go to a place, you do a puzzle, which is more wrestling with the jank of that puzzle than actually solving it. You die a lot, and then you see a set piece before you go to the next major area. Security Breach is definitely following that sort of classic Zelda-esque style of big set piece dungeon-like areas with bosses that you have to get past, and you'll get a thing at each one that'll help you access a new area, or that will just generally help you in the overworld. There's even branching paths and the option to go back and take one path you didn't go with later on in the game, but the problem lies in the execution of all of this. This game has a lot of jank. Not just steel wool overestimating how much you can get away with in Unreal Engine 4, but also mechanics that feel like they were not tested and dialed in enough before hitting stores, and the latter's going to cause you to die a lot, and especially in certain places where you feel like you were fine, but yeah, it turns out you weren't fine. Go run back to this area. Let's start with the stealth mechanics, since until you get both battery upgrades for Freddy and a means to defend yourself later in the game, most of this game is going to be you sneaking around as Gregory. I've had moments where an animatronic would appear a safe distance away from me, but then suddenly teleport behind me to instantly get me. Unfortunately, the security bots don't so much alert the animatronics to your location to send them in your general direction, as much as they instantly summon them to you, with sometimes comical results. You'll get grabbed by Blartbot over here, an animatronic will be teleported to quite literally just behind you, but it won't activate for a good 5 seconds, so you can just run past it. That is your best case scenario. The stealth system isn't the worst I've seen in this little experiment, as nothing will be worse than Hello Neighbors, but yeah, it's a mess. The little detection indicator is extremely unreliable, to the point that I eventually just ignored it and listened for the musical stings to see if I was detected or not. A whole nother issue is braking detection. The animatronics are smart enough to check hiding places, which would be fine, except for that there's almost, keyword almost, effectively no way to break whatever the game defines as line of sight in the early game. The way you do get animatronics to disengage before you have the tools to stun them is that you need to activate a distraction. The distraction will cause the nearest animatronic to drop whatever they are doing and go examine the thing you just messed with. And that's even if they are 5 feet away from you and have been chasing you for the last minute. Now, about how I said it works on the nearest animatronic. If it works, the one that's chasing you will suddenly forget Gregory exists and go look at the kiddie ride that went off for a good 10 seconds, and that will most likely cause it to break line of sight with you. When it doesn't work, a second animatronic will now have its attention draw to you, and now you've got 2 instant death machines chasing you across the atrium. Until you get the phaser blaster or the camera, you're just gonna have to wrestle with the button prompts and hope you get the prompt in time to activate the distraction, or die a lot. So the stealth is bad, and that's bad because there's a lot of this game that's playing a mostly helpless character who needs to sneak around in a very large area with lots of things that have nebulous detection rules. I will concede that intentionally or not, this creates some wonderful catharsis when you finally get a stun tool that lets you brazenly run past the animatronics, because you can just shoot them in their stupid faces, which not only shuts them down, but almost always breaks their line of sight. Except for Monty, who's smart enough to wear eye protection. I will neither confirm nor deny that I might have intentionally thrown certain segments when I saw that Monty spawned into an area that I needed to move around a lot. Now, with stealth out of the way, we're going to talk about dying, and don't worry, we're going to talk about another key element of the game after that. Dying is not only problematic because you are no longer alive, but also because Security Breach is very stingy with its checkpointing. Security Breach does have automatic checkpoints, but they're almost never where you want them, and on top of that, the game operates on a save point system, where you're gonna have maybe one at the beginning of a major area, and if it's a larger area, then there'll be one near the start of an important thing. You're going to be dying a whole lot while you learn how to manipulate the jank of stealth as best you can. And then you're going to be dying even more because there are certain segments, while not overtly just trial and error, are very poorly explained. You're going to be doing a lot of runbacks, like Dark Souls 2 levels of runback. When you're playing, it'll feel like you've been in certain sections forever, and one of the benefits of being a YouTube man is that I record and neatly organize all my gameplay, and thanks to all my footage, I can say with certainty that after reviewing it, certain segments only have substantively 5 to 10 minutes of actual stuff you're doing in them, but will take nearly an hour, thanks not so much to repeatedly failing while you're trying to figure out what you're supposed to do, but because it takes a solid minute or so to get back to where you need to be, if you don't get grabbed by anyone while you're trying to get there. Now, before I forget about it, yes, Security Breach does have the camera system, which is frequently mentioned as an important tool in Gregory's survival arsenal. It's effectively useless, and I will explain my stance on that. For one, while you can't access them anywhere, the cameras are often in weird places or at odd angles, and some of them will be outright useless. You can zoom and pivot them, but rarely are you going to be able to see anything you actually need to get a good look at. Like in this case, where the only thing I couldn't see with the cameras was where the doors were in an area, so it was very hard to rearrange the maze in this room effectively so I can start it. For another, and much more importantly, you cannot tell exactly where the cameras are, and even more importantly for that, what direction they're pointing from the UI. Like you can try to physically orient yourself in the real world and then try to figure out okay, I was looking at this camera, but inside of your Fazwatch, you cannot tell where exactly a camera is and where it's pointing. The latter is a massive problem. The in-game map not only does not let you zoom in on any part of the map, but is also nearly completely unlabeled as far as regions go or anything else. You do get some points of interest, and some points of interest. Half the major points of interest, such as charging stations, aren't even labeled properly, and I'm thinking this was more of an oversight because others are. Given that you can't use the map as a reference for the cameras, and you're not able to see what direction the camera is pointing, means that unless you want Gregory just standing out in the middle of the area, like in the open, which normally if you're looking at the camera, you do not want to be out in the open in that area, the cameras are effectively useless and sometimes even detrimental to surviving. You're probably gonna learn this the hard way when you're in this one hallway where you're trying to hide from an animatronic. I think it was Roxy. This one here, the one where you're in a single narrow passageway with no means of breaking any sort of line of sight if you get caught, and you will need to hide in these hampers to let the blart bots go past you. The one where, a single detection is a guaranteed game over. Yeah, you're going to need to use those cameras, or at least try to use them to see when the robots are moving past you while you hide, but you're gonna have a real hard time seeing where you are on these cameras, and you're just gonna have to guess. Oh yeah, and since I have this in my notes in quite a few places, I'll just say it here. While you're trying to hide from people, the sound propagation is not nearly good enough to kind of tell where someone is without actually seeing them. Like if you can't see an enemy through a little hole in your hiding place, there is no way to tell through audio cues where exactly an enemy is relative to you, if they've passed you or not. Heck, sometimes when I was in a large area, the game will have animatronics do a bark to notify the player that they're in this area, and rather than having it come from a distance where they'd actually be, it just sounds like a disembodied voice. And when we go over all of these things that are so important to a game that uses stealth, such as knowing where you are, knowing where your enemy is, sound propagation, knowing when you are detected, and then when you are detected, knowing when you have been able to break detection, and probably a lot of things I am forgetting right now despite all my note-taking, organizing, pre-writing, and all that crap I do for videos, it feels like Steel Wool might have felt obligated to make a sneak 'em up without understanding what a player needs to sneak around in an area, so the player just ends up running around, getting caught, having to do long runbacks, which turns maybe a 4 to 6 hour game into a 10 to 12 hour game, thanks to the game being very stingy with saving and checkpoints. By the way, if you try to play past 6 a.m. to get the good endings, there will be only one save point in the entire game in the middle of the atrium. Have fun with those runbacks and safety saves. So about those puzzles and scenarios you're going to be doing in each part of the Pizzaplex, particularly the ones that take upwards of an hour thanks to runback or it being hard to see what you're doing. There are a lot of things in this game that just don't work well. Things like the puzzles that rely on anything to do with button prompts, especially if there are multiple button prompts close to each other. Mazer size. Double demerits for mazer size, because it also requires you to constantly check the security cameras, and unless you hit the far left buttons in a really weird roundabout way, it's also gonna automatically open the door into the control room, which is gonna get you caught by the blart bots, which will summon the animatronic into a relatively small area, and you'll keep needing to run back and forth for this puzzle. Oh, I hate mazer size. There's other stuff too where it feels like Steel Wool might have seen something cool in another game, tried to implement it, but missed an important part of that mechanic. The big one for me are the endoskeletons and how not to do a game of red light, green light. I've been beating up on this game pretty bad, and I don't want to go into overkill. I've been pretty brutal so far, frankly. So I'm just gonna give a short explanation on why it doesn't work here, and then give you a couple explanations on how games that do this well do it. Security breach puts you in situations where there is no way to move around the endoskeletons without passing right by them, and in some cases forces you to turn away from the endoskeletons to achieve certain tasks. You have to either put yourself in a position where you can see how fast you can wrestle with these glitchy button prompts, so it's basically a dice roll to see if you're gonna advance the game or do a big long run back and start this segment all over again. Or alternatively, you can intentionally look away from them in certain places to try and kite them as far away as possible from the objective so you can press buttons in peace. One good example that is very popular and frankly a classic of indie horror is SCP Containment Breach. Containment Breach has SCP-173, the peanut version, not the modern version. I understand why that happened, and it's just a kind of a way to tell the eras apart. Who, if you somehow don't know who this little guy is, somebody has to have a direct line of sight on him at all times, or else he will perform an advanced vibe check on the nearest human quite literally faster than you can blink. The inciting incident for SCP Containment Breach is that this little guy got loose and his tummy has the rumblies that only crushing your windpipe can satisfy. Sucks that basically every door in this facility has a button you need to push facing the door. However, to mitigate this, there's a feature that I would have loved to have learned about when I was playing because I suck at video games, that's why I'm a YouTuber, where you can press a button directly behind you so that you never have to break eye contact with 173, and there's not only means of extending how long you're able to look at 173 without blinking, but also objects that you can use to track it through the facility so you can avoid it completely. The other good example of how to play red light, green light in a video game is Soldierus from Lost in Vivo, which is an amazing little game that you should totally check out if you somehow haven't already. There's a segment where you will encounter an entity known as Soldierus, this freaky guy right here, and it will be between you and saving your dog. Soldierus works very much like SCP-173 or an endoskeleton. Lost in Vivo makes Soldierus hard, but rewarding to do by, for one, having certain areas where Soldierus just won't go for some reason. Then, having things that you need to interact with being laid out in a way to where you can loop around them without ever losing your line of sight so he won't get you. This is balanced with rooms where you can just barely see him over these boxes, or other rooms where there are a lot of objects that have a very similar shape to Soldierus. There's a whole lot of tension, and this is a fairly small segment in the game, but Soldierus is just such a memorable encounter. Back to Security Breach though. So much of this game feels like good ideas, bad execution, with there not only being some key elements missing, not being able to tell the direction of a camera, no means to interact with an object while playing red light, green light, an unreliable map that doesn't show you all the places where you can charge Freddy, and so on. But there is one area that I really enjoyed with Security Breach, and that's just the characters and the world. I 100% love this idealized 80s throwback aesthetic, and I love the unapologetic schlock that was the intro. I love how much of a goober this iteration of Freddy is, which makes him an excellent foil to the rapidly deteriorating Pizzaplex around him. On that note, the Pizzaplex itself is a character. The staff bots have a lot of silly moments, like the comedian robot who's trying its best, and the unhinged elevator PSAs. Like, I got a good actual laugh the first time I heard the one about bears being extinct. I love the little touches, like the dark carpeting that you saw in all the arcades in the late 90s and the turn of the century. I love how even if it's only minor, each of the animatronics have their own little character arcs and actual personalities, even if at times we only see bits and pieces of them. While mechanically a mess, and also with certain lore elements, but I'm not gonna get too into that because I'm not the one to speak on such things. This game is made with a lot of love. It's also pretty accurate to its source material. Source material, I hear you say? Didn't you just acknowledge that thing about the so-called true ending? Which I will get to later on, but I mean it in a different way. I'm gonna hazard a guess that at least one other channel that normally does FNaF has probably talked about this, but I'm gonna say it anyway because I have fond memories of this place. The Pizzaplex is based on a real-world place. No, really. There is an IRL chain of entertainment centers with huge arcades, pizza and other like food restaurant things, mini golf, go-karts, laser tag, bowling, special birthday areas, and all the other things that the Pizzaplex doesn't have, like rock climbing and bumper boats and a bunch of other things too, depending on where you go. It's called boomers. They were called that long before the term meant what it does nowadays. There's a lot of places like boomers, but very little can directly compare to it. To sort of put it into a point of reference for folks that didn't have boomers or something like that in their area, Chuck E. Cheese or Showbiz, depending on your age and where you grew up as a kid, was kind of an entry-level thing. It was the place you went like if you were well behaved at church or got a good report card. Given the franchise we're talking about, I don't think I need to go deeper than that on Chuck E. Cheese. A step up from the Pasquale's Pizza Ghost Kitchen is Dave & Buster's, which is a large, fully indoors place that skews considerably older with a full restaurant bar and sometimes pool tables or bowling. D&B was where you went when you were a little too old for Chuck E. Cheese, but you still wanted to play some arcade games and win some prizes. Boomers was special. It had to be somebody's birthday or an after-school center summer trip to go to Boomers. Boomers was the kind of place you were willing to shell out for, although I actually went and checked and the prices are surprisingly good for the inflation hell spiral we're in right now. Because Boomers had basically everything, and the only real place that topped it was like if you lived near Disneyland. Although that was 10 to 20 years ago, and based on some of the stuff I've seen, I'll be so bold as to say that Boomers might have overtaken Big Man Walt's intellectual property palace for these days. I don't think I need to pay extra money and download a whole ass app onto my phone to get in line at a Boomers. The only major difference between Boomers and the Five Nights at Freddy's Pizzaplex is that for one, there are no robots in Boomers, at least when I used to go there, and for another, while stuff like the arcade, laser tag, and bowling are indoors, most of Boomers is an outdoors affair, thanks to the majority of their locations being in either California or Florida, where the weather is good year-round. And to cap this off, if you're wondering why I'm so confident about the Pizzaplex being based on Boomers, is for one, I'm sure like MadPat or some other big theory channel has probably talked about this in a video before, because examining IRL source material is usually a good starting point to extrapolate. And for another, while I was learning about the devs at Steel Wool for this video, they are literally sitting in the Boomers go-karts in the About Us page of their website. I recognize those. Those are the go-karts from Boomers. It was like a core memory being unlocked for me because I forgot about this for the longest time, but then I saw that and I'm like, oh shit, that's Boomers. I haven't been there in ages. And just to hammer this assertion home even more, the major attractions at the Boomers nearest to Steel Wool Studio are go-karts, mini golf, and laser tag. 10 out of 10 Steel Wool, you could not find a cooler place for your inspiration. More video games need to take place at Boomers. If any of you are watching this have the opportunity to go, you need to go to Boomers. It is awesome. I am not being paid to say any of this. And out of curiosity while writing this script, as I went later on and was revising, I just did a random YouTube search that was quote unquote FNaF security breach Boomers. And I got nothing that was actually relevant. You think someone would have brought this up by now, since it is the closest thing to the real Pizzaplex if you're into FNaF, but I can see why this might be a more niche thing. For one, most of Boomers locations are in California, and while the Golden State is the most populous in the Union, not everyone in the world lives there. And for another, even if you did grow up in California, maybe you weren't a Boomers family. Maybe you just stuck to Chuck E. Cheese or Dave & Buster's. Maybe your family did Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor back when those still existed. Maybe you were one of the blessed few who grew up in the right zip code at the right time and thus had access to the Disneyland SoCal Neighbor Pass back when that was such an amazing value that if you just wandered into Disneyland at least once a month, it was more cost effective and outright cheaper than any of the previously mentioned places. And what's more likely out of any of these is that Security Breach came out when we were in full lockdown mode, and thus places like Boomers were either shut down or at heavily limited operating capacity, so any enterprising lore or fandom people most likely wouldn't have been able to check it out while the game was in the forefront of the FNaF fandom. Seriously though, if you ever get an opportunity, go to Boomers. It's great. I love it. Forget about anything to do with Freddy for a sec. Boomers is the greatest place ever, and I love it. Alright, that was a nice break from going through the core gameplay, as I felt things were getting a little too negative there. If you're new to the channel and wondering why I went so in-depth like that, I'd like to assure you I'm not just trying to dunk on the mascot horror franchise, trying its hardest at more traditional gameplay. In fact, I'm trying to take Security Breach as seriously as possible and treat it like any other major game. And that means not pulling punches when I come across mechanics that are poorly implemented and make the game a frustrating experience. I know I have the benefit of playing a much later version of this game that's been patched, and that also gives me the benefit of being able to see past stuff that can potentially be fixed and look at core issues of the game, such as the stealth, or how having huge indoor environments combined with ray tracing isn't very good for performance even on big beefy computers. And with that being said, another place Security Breach falls flat on its face is the scare factor. Security Breach is a Five Nights at Freddy's game, which means that it's probably gonna have some jump scares. While jump scares can be looked down upon or considered cheap or unearned frights, and frankly some other games this July, or I guess August now, have certainly proven this assertion, if a game is built around the jump scares similar to how the original games in this series were, that can and even does work. Security Breach isn't built around being in a situation where the prospect of a jump scare is always looming over you like the older games, but is instead in a big open area where you can hide from and cheese your way around the baddies. A jump scare isn't much of a jump if I know the animatronic is right behind me, or if I know I whiffed it when trying to stay out of Blartbot's line of sight. There's some moments where you're doing things that are definitely a throwback to the older games, but they just don't have the tension if you're ever trapped in an area with animatronics actively coming to get you, because you know you're gonna be out of there in less than a minute or so and escape and move on to the next thing. Then outside of those situations, the best way I can describe a lot of the roaming scares is like you're in a haunted maze or some like haunted attraction like that, and you accidentally make eye contact with a scare actor lurking in a corner, and the whole thing is ruined before it can happen. And while this usually, when it goes down IRL, the actors will just kind of shrug or nod at you or something and then keep quiet to try to get a jump on the next party, this feels more like the scare actors kind of felt embarrassed about it and tried to jump out anyway, and now it's even more awkward. Once you get past the botched attempts at jump scares, Security Breach doesn't have a whole lot to offer in the form of more traditional spookiness. It does help things later on when the Pizzaplex gets more rundown as something progresses in the bowels of a facility, but I'm never unnerved by the animatronics in any state they're in, and I know these guys are capable of looking pretty spooky based on other games. I'm not gonna do a story rundown in this video because I know there are novels and a bunch of other things I don't have access to since we're judging things only by the game itself here, but I'll talk about that later on when I get into the DLC just for some clarification. But I assure you for now that I got many of the endings, and yes, I got what was, keyword was, the true ending among others. The Pizzaplex is just too bright and colorful most times to really get scary moments, and the moments of humor are a little too good. I still can't get over the PA system negging kids into thinking they'll have no friends if they have their birthdays at home. The non-jump scare stuff is like, oh no, the little music guy is in the vent with me, moving at a very mild pace. I better crawl faster, which is a little tense the first time it happens, but after the third or so time, you're just like, okay, fine, I'll sprint through this vent. And you know that nothing bad's gonna happen since you've already figured out that this little twerp won't chase you past the vent opening. That's a big problem with the non-jumpy scares in this game, is that they keep reusing them, and scares have massively diminishing returns. Yeah, I was like, oh shit, when the night filter came on at the top of the hour at like 1 a.m. But by 5 a.m. I was like, fine, I'll get in the charger, can we move this along? Scares also get overused when you see shattered animatronics wandering around the Pizzaplex like nothing happened later in the game. A shattered animatronic goes from, Jesus Christ, what happened to Chica when I first saw it, to her wandering around the Pizzaplex and going, oh, hey, it's Chica. I guess I can shoot my way through this one. This is mostly the same with all the animatronics still being around after you shatter them, because while it does increase the gameplay difficulty because certain things change about them making them harder to deal with, it decreases the scare factor of their shattered looks because you get used to having them around. It's just generally never a good idea to show the monster, especially showing it frequently. And once we're out of direct attempts at giving you a good little fright, the indirect stuff is lacking. The ambient music, when it's there, doesn't do much to ratchet up the tension if it's doing anything at all. Usually most ambient OSTs for horror games hit that sweet spot where you're not noticing it directly, but it's in the back of your head, and it helps like slowly ratchet things up. In Security Breach, I actually got to a point where I started actively listening for the music beyond the in-world theme music for the Pizzaplex because I was getting weirded out by the lack of stuff beyond loud stings when an animatronic saw me. There definitely is some music there, but it's used a little too sparingly to the point where it can't do its job. I thought I was crazy at first when it came to this, so I went and like rewatched my footage of the game, and while there are plenty of ambient tracks early on, in the middle of the game, it feels like it's missing aside from certain themes that are associated with certain entities like the animatronics. And then there's just a lot of that noise you hear in a lot of ambient tracks, you know, that sort of like inside of a cave type sound that's usually the underlying noise that accompanies the music. Yeah, that thing. I normally don't talk about music and sound direction very much because I try not to play too much stuff in videos that like always has a chance of getting me some sort of claim, because just because like a game has the rights to use music does not mean me on my YouTube channel has the rights to use it. But this just made me scratch my head. If I had to guess, I think a lot of what they did here is directly tied to animatronics and major antagonists. So when you're just out doing something unrelated to the major bads of an area, you only get the cave noises if you get anything at all. And then as far as like atmosphere goes, good atmosphere is a rare exception and nowhere near the norm in Security Breach. Now don't get me wrong, there are some areas with great atmosphere in Security Breach. Running through the daycare when the lights are killed, shattering Chica and escaping through the trash tunnels, and the Princess Quest games, which were pretty atmospheric for what they are. The rest of the game is just a little too well lit, even when it's later in the night. It doesn't have that run-down look and feel that you can usually find in the not just older FNaF games, but horror in general. It feels like maybe in a facility this big that probably costs a lot of money to quite literally keep the lights on, they kill the lights for the night since no one's supposed to be in here. Some real darkness could really help things like making the blarp bots a little scarier, because all you'd see is their flashlights before they got you, and then you'd see their face. And also it'd be harder to see where exactly the animatronics are since I don't think they light up. It'd also probably help with performance issues too, which on that note, while I did turn the ray tracing off, all the shadows and everything else were on, and believe me, games could be scary before ray tracing existed. Even in the final area, where by no means it should be so well lit considering where you on, you've got full lighting. And when you're in a well lit area, you can easily get a good look at the animatronics, which we have already said it is never a good idea to let the player or the viewer get a good look at the monster. I almost wonder if they just like barely finished making these environments in these areas, but they never got time to play with lighting or other things to give it more ambience, and it was just time to ship. We gotta get it out there. So now we've got this unnaturally well lit for like the wee hours of the morning place. It's just, there's so much to think about with this game, but first, let's take a break from the breach and have our cooking segment for this video. This cooking segment is going to be extra special because it's a throwback to the first one I ever did about 6 years ago. We're making grilled cheese. Welcome to the new kitchen, by the way. If things seem a little hokey, I am quite literally figuring it out as I am making this cooking segment. Not too much has changed about the prep and the cooking of this little number here. It's still fairly simple. We're just going to be using nicer ingredients and better technique. First order of business is the bread. I made an extra thick loaf for an extra thick time. And if you want to see how I do bread, we did the full recipe in the Bendy in the Dark Revival video. If you can't or just don't feel like doing your own bread, there's this neat kitchen hack you can do called buying it from the store. Maybe treat yourself and get one of those nice bakery loaves instead of the stuff in the bread aisle. Prepping the bread is fairly straightforward. If you're using your own loaf, make some not too thick slices, and then we're gonna slather them up with the fat of our choice, either softened butter or mayonnaise. For the mayonnaise, you can be all fancy and make it yourself. I learned how to do this through the book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, which is an amazing read for anyone who likes cooking on any level. And you soften your butter by just leaving it out for a couple hours, or maybe just zapping it in the microwave at 30% power for 30 seconds. You want it soft but not melty. Then as for making your own mayo, either use a hand blender like I'm trying to here, or a real blender as my wife suggested and is probably right about, and you just take egg yolks and you add olive oil until it's done. I added a little bit of sriracha to give it a bit of heat, and if that just doesn't work out for you, there is still that amazing kitchen hack called just buying that stuff from the store. I'm only really using my own mayo here because I also know that while there is raw egg in this, I am going to be cooking it. I really don't know how things stand on like raw eggs being made into mayo. I am not an expert on that, so whatever works for you. Once the slices are lathered up, we're gonna freshly grate some Parmesan cheese, which yes, you need to grate yourself as the pre-shredded stuff comes coated with something on it that makes it harder to melt, but it also helps it like stay separated, and that's bad for what we're doing here. We're gonna cheese it up. Don't cheese it up as hard as I did though. I kind of did overkill and this turned out a bit salty, but lightly cover the outer sides of your bread with the fat on them with your Parmesan, and then they're basically ready to cook once we slice up our cheese. Alright, admittedly, we're skipping around a bit here, but as for the cheeses that go on the inside, we're going to use cheddar for flavoring, and then some provolone in the middle for that ooey gooey goodness. Now, if you can, you should definitely buy these cheeses as blocks and slice it up yourself, because not only is that ounce for ounce cheaper, but is also generally higher quality stuff without any of the additives they use to keep the slices from fusing with each other, and that can again impede the meltage. Slice or shred up all that cheese, and then we're gonna have our stovetop on medium-low because we want these on here for long enough to melt the insides without burning the outsides. Once you can take a drop of water that's on your finger and have it instantly evaporate onto your grilling device of choice, that means it's hot and ready. I'm using my cast iron here, but you don't need one of these, and frankly, after the results I got, I think you might be better off with a non-stick because it took a little bit of elbow grease to get my layer of Parmesan off the pan, but it got off. No cast irons were harmed in the making of this video. Place one slice of bread, Parmesan and fat side down before loading up the cheese and placing another slice on top of it with that fat and Parmesan side up. Hard part's over. Now we just gotta wait it out for maybe 3 to 5 minutes, perhaps partially covering your pan to help the melting process of the cheese along. And then when we see that the Parmesan cheese on the fringes of the bread that is like on the pan is starting to get a little brown and like melty, then we get under it, flip it, and yeah, you know the rest. Cook it for a little more until both sides are the level of golden or brown you prefer, and take them off the heat. Now we cut them right down the middle for that sick cheese pull, which I failed to do because I got carried away with all this cheese here. And then we serve it up with some tomato soup or even just plain old marinara sauce for dunking in. Remember that all patrons at the $5 tier or higher for recipes get all the recipes I'm doing this month, plus all the other ones I do, with standalone videos and details to go with them. And since we're running that Halloween in July special where anyone who takes advantage of the yearly discount at the recipe tier or higher gets their own patron apron just like mine that I made myself as a free gift. Now let's get back to the video. We're gonna take a step back for a moment because Security Breach is a game that does have some important context worth going over, which is less about some kind of internet drama or important story information being put into a secondary source. There was kind of something like the latter, but as I understand it, it wasn't anything that was super vital to understanding or appreciating things that was put in the books and comics. The development cycle was rough, and Steel Wool themselves weren't exactly in the best position to be making the game, and that is before the big obvious thing. This was a lockdown era game. I don't know exactly when development started, but this game was delayed multiple times, and while I know this might be fresh in everyone's memory, I'll say it anyway. On top of all the horrific stuff associated with the advent of a new big thing that I'm not sure if it's still a demonetizable offense to talk about, which at the time we had no idea of the extent of it or how we deal with it. The transition from the before times in office scenarios to going all remote for work was not a good environment to be doing anything creative in the slightest, and video games are an extremely creative medium. If you wondered why hardly anyone finished their novels or whatever during lockdown, being confined to your room while the news is constantly blasting nightmare stuff at you from every device in your house is just not a good headspace for creative work. But Steel Wool had to get the game done. Like I said, there were multiple delays, and since I haven't said it in a while, let's go over my rule for delays. 1 is fine and shows a willingness to keep quality control over hype. 2 is concerning, as now there have been multiple times that management has underestimated the scope of their project. And 3 or more delays is the time that you take all your expectations and lower that bar right to the floor. Just be happy if it comes out at all. The big thing threw a massive wrench into that system, since personally I consider anything from early 2020 to maybe let's say early 2023 to be kind of a black hole for getting anything done. It's kind of like, okay, we're just gonna all look the other way on that and try to pick up later. Security Breach very much has a lot of cut content, including entire game systems like being able to actually drive the go-karts. I don't exactly know how much of the original game we got, but we definitely did not get the whole thing. I'm also aware of a lot of quality of life things that got added in subsequent years, which I have the benefit of having it be my first time playing with these things, but as far as I know, it's just basic stuff and not cut content that might have changed how the game worked. No content that I am aware of was restored or added added outside of like very basic things, making it less like a Postal 4 situation and more of Steel Wool just trying to get the game functional. Another thing worth looking at is Steel Wool itself. On top of being a relatively small studio, based on their Steam catalog and their MO, they're mostly a VR studio. Almost all of their games are meant for VR, with their pre-FNaF stuff being little games you could get for your HTC Vive. You remember those, small, kind of simplistic experiences, since back then everyone was still trying to figure out how exactly you make a game for a VR headset, and also VR headsets. Now that I think of it, VR headsets never really like adopted any crazy standards. Like I still see that like Oculus is different from like what Valve has, different from like all these little third-party things, but we're getting sidetracked here. I can't speak for Steel Wool's games in particular since I don't own a VR headset to try them out, but they're all generally well reviewed on Steam, even if none of the pre-FNaF games crack 100 reviews total. While their FNaF games have a so-called flat mode, that's not the same thing as making a designated traditional game. Unless there's like some other lost titles that Steel Wool just never put up anywhere, Security Breach is their first outing for a AAA game. I'd imagine it's a lot different making a VR-centric game than it is making a first-person horror title with exploration, item collections, and all the stuff like having adversaries that move around in places where the player can't go. Another tricky situation was handling the lore. I'm not involved enough with a Five Nights series to really know the finer points of the lore, but I'm familiar with it enough to know that it's taken very seriously, on par with how some people used to be with Star Wars before the great greedy rat broke our wills to feel invested. I say that as someone who used to be really into Star Wars, particularly the Old Republic, and I can personally attest that after the big buyout, we had so much stuff of just such a scattershot of quality that even if I shut out all the, discourse that started appearing everywhere with the cottage industry of being aggressively miserable online, I just couldn't find the will to keep up with Star Wars anymore. The only time I ever even saw any part of episode 9 was when I was flipping channels on a hotel TV. I watched about 30 minutes of it, which took me 15 minutes to realize it was Star Wars, and then changed the channel since it wasn't a very engaging movie. And if you're curious, I kinda checked out of Star Wars in about 2018 after the Battlefront 2 2017, and then seeing The Last Jedi right off the bat of that coming out of the theater going, that was okay, but I don't think I'm gonna see the next one in the theater. I've really had no will to participate in Star Wars. I know there's that one show that everyone's getting all up in arms about. I don't know about it. I don't want to know about it. I've checked out. I've still got my Star Wars Empire at War when I'm feeling nostalgic, and last I checked, the mouse can't take that away from me because I still have my hard copy. And I only bring this up because from an outsider's perspective, people still seem to very much care, like very deeply about the story associated with these games. Hard to follow parts be damned. Steel Wool got handed this beloved IP and then told, okay, continue the story, good luck with that. I think one of the issues here, outside of the thing that I swear I will get to, is that based on the premise of the game, Steel Wool had to give personalities and mannerisms to characters that were literal robots, asterisk. Again, I'm not sure how it works for the Glamrock gang. For most of the main games, the main characters, as far as I've ever been able to tell, have no real personalities, or at the very least, understated ones that the fandom sort of gave them their own fanon personalities. Plural, some people interpret people one way, some the other. I don't know enough about this to tell you definitively one way or the other which it is here, but there's two outcomes for adding personalities to blank slate characters. One is that it directly clashes with fanon interpretations and people won't be happy about that, or two, it tries to play into the fanon interpretation of these characters a little too much and people feel pandered to in the wrong way, resulting in no one liking it. This is sidestepped a bit by having two characters who are wholly new animatronics, and then other characters who, as I understand before, had some characterization in previous games, but those were Steel Wool's own creations. Taking over a franchise is a very delicate situation, especially when it's something that people care about as much as Five Nights at Freddy's. And that leads us to Ruin. Literally. Nearly everything I've talked about in the gameplay of Security Breach has been addressed and greatly improved in Ruin. Ruin is an entirely different experience from the base game in the best way possible. If anything, we probably would have gotten something more like Ruin if the big bad thing didn't happen, and Steel Wool had time and the proper headspace to get the game done right the first time around. Or at the very least, Ruin is proof that Steel Wool can make good traditional games. Perhaps it was a matter of getting more experience, or maybe a matter of getting more comfortable with the big IP they were handed. I can't help but notice the fact pattern for Steel Wool getting FNaF seems very similar to how sometimes a small-time movie director that's had the slightest amount of success will suddenly get put in charge of a big movie franchise, except for in this situation, Steel Wool is a game dev, and once they got comfortable, they started doing really well. Let's finally take a second to talk about Ruin. Ruin is indeed an entirely different experience from Security Breach, and frankly, based on what you do in Ruin, I think it's better suited to the title Security Breach than the base game. Before we get into just how different of an experience it is, I'll tell you what you need to know about the premise. In Ruin, it has been an indeterminate amount of time since the events of the base game, and whatever happened at the end there, the Pizzaplex got pretty busted up. You play as Cassie, a friend of Gregory's who's received a message from him to come and save him from the depths of the Pizzaplex. Cassie's well versed in the ins and outs of the Pizzaplex machinations as her dad's a technician there. She even knows how to use the proprietary tools and tech that get her pretty much anywhere she needs to go. She also got this cool mask from one of the robots that gives her what's essentially admin access to all the animatronics after pairing it with her occipital lobe. Look, I'm not very well versed in fast tech, but I'd say that putting on a mask that pairs itself with your brain has got to be like inserting a USB stick you found at an airport into the computer you do your banking on times 1,000, since you can't exactly format your occipital lobe like a graphics driver. Gregory and the new visual HALLOWEEN in your peripheral, Helpy, sends you a message over Discord asking you to help them test the game they've been working on by using your new AR mask to disable the Pizzaplex's antivirus and run it as admin. Now we can talk about how Ruin takes every problem that Security Breach had and not only fixes them, but greatly improves the game. Remember how I spent all that time talking about what might be causing the graphical issues? How all those big enclosed areas where you could see pretty far were most likely throwing a shitload of triangles and high-res textures at you with little opportunity for LODs or culling? Well, now the Pizzaplex is half destroyed, so all the areas you're going to be going through are pretty closed off and claustrophobic, with lots of dust in the air further obscuring your vision, meaning the game runs great. I didn't even bother to tweak anything in my settings because I didn't even notice any slowdowns or hitching as I played. It's also great for the atmosphere, but we'll talk about that a bit more later. Also, now instead of being constantly harangued by a bunch of security bots running all over the place that will summon the animatronics to literally right behind you, in most cases it's just going to be you and a single animatronic, which leads to actual tension as you're trying to elude them instead of just moving around and hoping the blurp bots don't teleport them behind you. On the note of the animatronics, while we got a lot of Freddy in the base game, now we get some more development for the other animatronics, and better pacing, better spookies, and better gameplay, as the use of the AR mask is not only a good way to spice things up, but provides an interesting twist to surviving. You need to use the mask to interact with certain things in order to progress deeper into the Pizzaplex, but wearing the mask for too long allows the entity to find and chase you down. While there are some decent spooky moments in Ruin, it feels like in some way they were obligated to have a bunch of jump scares, so they just crammed them all into the intro sequence. No, really, after the third or fourth one I had in the span of like inside of 30 seconds, I started keeping a literal tally of them. And based on my counting and pairing anything with an aggressive musical sting to like be a jump scare, there are 9 attempts at jump scares before we hit the title screen, plus a few other not so aggressive attempts. Honestly, it feels like we're just getting them out of our system here, because after that, and the usual gotcha stuff when the animatronics make a funny noise at you, they don't go for the cheap stuff anymore. If anything, the jump scares aren't so much jump scares anymore as they are actual death animations. They're full-on animated sequences where the animatronic that got you will go in for the kill, and Cassie even fights back and prolongs it for a second before the inevitable happens. I'm okay with that though, because once we're in the Pizzaplex, we finally got that spooky atmosphere we so badly needed in the base game. Cutting down on those big environments for performance also makes things nice and spooky, because I can't just run around a huge well-lit atrium to ditch whoever I need to ditch. I'm stuck in here with whatever wants me gone. Closed off areas means more intense sneaking around and more chances to get caught. And on top of that, you finally need to use the cameras, and thank goodness they are useful now. You can now not only see where a camera is pointing to get your bearings, but you also get an ability to call away an enemy to somewhere where you're hopefully not, or in some cases playing a very dangerous game where you lure them to somewhere like right next to you so you can just barely slip by them to deactivate a security node. I cannot stress enough how much having the Pizzaplex being utterly wrecked helps the atmosphere of this game. It's no mistake that the few places I felt spooky vibes in the base game were either rundown, forgotten areas, or places where something was going wrong. Having everything busted up just makes for good gameplay scenarios. I'm not thinking about what's around me besides Monty when I'm on the catwalks in the base game, but when the catwalks are mostly destroyed and half of what's left is covered in some kind of suspicious goo that'll have you falling to your death in a literal second, you take more time to be careful and end up feeling the tension of an area. And since we're on the subject of the catwalks above Monty Golf, I'm going to talk about my favorite thing about Ruin, the AR mask. It's not only a great gameplay tool, but a wonderful narrative device. The Vanny mask does a lot more than let you see and interact with the Pizzaplex's security system. It also lets you see the condition of the environment around you and potential paths around obstacles. The twist is that on top of summoning this guy that I kept referring to Glitch Trap, even though I know that's not Glitch Trap, is that there are also certain cyberspace barriers that you can't move through with the mask on. And what's especially spicy about that is that the opposite is true as well. Certain obstacles are revealed to be mere projections or perhaps something else that is entirely different when you put on the mask and look at them. Traversable paths get revealed, barriers turn out to be non-existent, and there are even straight up portals that let you traverse otherwise impossible distances. Or are you? We never get a chance to see any of these illusory walls until after we put on the AR mask, and it does have the brain equivalent of a command prompt window opening for half a second. Cassie often questions how the mask is letting her traverse through what appears to be solid objects as far as we can tell with the mask off, that is, and we know that Helpy over here gives us pop-ups even when the mask is off. We have no idea how much of what we're seeing is real, and Ruin pulls this off so well. Games that want to do something like this are few and far between, and even rarer with ones that pull it off well. The best example I can think of is a game 15 years Ruin senior, Penumbra Black Plague, which if you didn't know about that one, it's a game made by the people who made the Amnesia series before they made Amnesia, in which the player character has a literal brainworm in him called Clarence who blatantly messes with his perception for laughs. I did a video on the Penumbra trilogy a while back that you should check out in your spare time. And one last thing before we go into the big story fixes is how Ruin abandons the save point system for some good old-fashioned checkpoints. Thank goodness, this cuts out the majority of the runbacks and repetitive tasks you do in-game, and there's also no more waiting for the save to happen. I can appreciate just how much this smooths the flow of gameplay. Okay, I think I'm gonna put up a spoiler warning and talk about that stuff real quick, but nowhere near in depth as outsiders or people that are used to FNaF are used to hearing. We're just going to be quick here. On the note of animatronics, we get to learn more about them, including seeing a bit of Rock's redemption, especially towards the end. We also get the Monty lore, and a bit more about what might have happened with Glamrock Bonnie. As much as I like Glamrock Freddy's character in the base game, there was just so much of him that we hardly got to see anyone else. And while Monty and Chica aren't exactly in a state to be talking, the extra bits we get from Roxy and more importantly, Cassie's connection to her are very much appreciated. Cassie's dilemma about dealing with Roxy to save Gregory felt well earned after we got the bits and pieces of Cassie's own background through Ruin, and further solidifies my belief that if Steel Wool just had some better circumstances, the base game would be worlds better than what we got, and they're capable of solid writing when everything isn't imploding around them. Sure, it's not some extremely nuanced 5D chess story, but not everything needs to be like that. Sometimes a story with a lot of complex ideals gets lost in the weeds and becomes a confusing, contradictory mess. Maybe we're just playing as a lonely kid who gets in way over her head trying to save what might just be her only friend in the world. And along the way, she's got to do some stuff that might really hurt, and that's all we need to have to feel connected to a character. And then we get clarification on the base game's ending. Back in the base game, what was at the time considered the true ending felt like a cop-out to me, and I'll briefly break the beginner's mindset rule again to say that it wasn't received so well. That's not exactly something that's hard to know about though. Just about every video about security breach I watched back in the day before I ever had an idea to do this series, which was made by people actually into FNaF and not just people tent-poling to try and dunk on the game for clicks, was demonstrably upset with Burntrap showing up. The short of it is that somehow Afton has returned, and we have to press buttons to defeat him. As far as the final showdown goes, it's a big letdown gameplay-wise too. Confronting Burntrap was just mostly waiting for Roxy to eventually show up, and then hiding behind the one cot where she couldn't get us, and then just popping out to press buttons until you get the final cutscene. And even then, your payoff is kind of lame, with who I think is supposed to be Molten Freddy finally decides to peel himself off the metaphorical couch and do something about Burntrap. I think this ending could have been presented better with maybe Molten Freddy, instead of just having him hanging out in the pizza pit, maybe instead he grabs Gregory and like throws him down in there, which may have the implication of maybe Molten Freddy trying to use Gregory to lure out Burntrap. But that's a big shoulda, woulda, coulda. Ruin decides that the Burntrap ending isn't canon anymore, and that the new canon ending, which is much more conducive to not only avoiding turning William Afton into FNaF's Palpatine, but also keeping the story open-ended, is that the Save Vanessa ending is the new canon ending, and an entity known as the Mimic was pulling the strings and possibly tried to impersonate Afton as Burntrap in the old true ending. The Mimic, well, mimics things, including the sound of Gregory's voice to lure Cassie into the ruined Pizzaplex and disable the countermeasures that were put in place to prevent specifically the Mimic from ever leaving the Pizzaplex. It's not exactly a huge reveal, with me even writing down in my notes, like on the first potential hint that something's not up to snuff during the first camera segment. The Mimic is basically pulling a Shodan, but it's done in a way where it's not out of nowhere when the big reveal happens, with Cassie even questioning the logic of some of the things the Mimic asked her to do while posing as Gregory. The veneer even starts to fall apart as Cassie gets closer to the sinkhole to clue in even the most oblivious of players that something isn't on the level with Gregory. I think I missed explaining something though, since I understand this might attract an audience that isn't into 20-plus-year-old classic video games. Just in case you didn't know, which there's nothing wrong with not knowing since these games are ancient, this is a plot device that references like one of the oldest in modern video game storytelling. In a little game called System Shock 2, the player character is contacted by one Dr. Polito while aboard the Von Braun and follows her instructions to make it through the mutant-infested ship. This, however, turns out to be a complete ruse, with the player discovering the body of the real Dr. Polito shortly before they meet who they've really been taking orders from, Shodan, the big bad from the first System Shock game. It wasn't even much of a twist back then, since Shodan was on the cover of the box for goodness sake, and the game starts with her taunting the player character from the last game. We've all played at least one game that does the Shodan twist, and it probably existed before 1999 and System Shock 2, be it in a video game or other media. Lots of games have tried to do the Shodan twist with varying levels of success. Heck, Ken Levine himself, as in the guy who directed System Shock 2, has been trying to recreate the magic of that game for the last 25 years, if the previews of his next game, Judas, are anything to go over. Speaking of Mr. Levine, I think that Ruin would do a lot better if they did something similar to Burial at Sea. Not so much of breaking your continuity so that no one else can mess with it after you're gone, if anything Ruin fixes what Security Breach broke, but more along the lines of how Ruin would be a better introduction to the Pizzaplex with everything being wrecked and all the animatronics already shattered. And then later on, after a few stories, we get the events of the base game and get to see the Pizzaplex in its prime, and how the animatronics were supposed to look before Gregory decided to start kit bashing Freddy. I know this is getting back into shoulda, woulda, coulda, but this would have led to a great mystique if we played a couple stories in the ruined Pizzaplex, wondering what it was like in its prime, and then later on we get Gregory's story to show us how this giant wreck was supposed to look, and it'd be the coolest thing ever. But yeah, we didn't get that. Still, we'll try their best. Final thoughts on Security Breach are, for one, holy moly, I was not expecting to be so invested in this game that I'd end up writing 10,000 words about it, which actually, hold that thought, it's even more after I went back and did edits for clarity and stuff, doing like read aloud tests and what have you. And as I am recording this, while I have not like edited out all the pauses and stuff from the audio, this is well over an hour before I even put any clips onto the timeline, so oh boy. And by the way, none of this is counting like stuff like the cooking segment in the intro. But on a more practical note for you guys, my recommendation is to wait for a sale, and then only play Ruin. Ruin is a nice little experience which, despite what the game tells you, can be enjoyed without playing the base game. I'd say only play Security Breach if you're really into FNaF, which, if that's the case, you probably already have, and odds are you have strong opinions about it. Maybe we play it 5 to 10 years from now when advancement in computer hardware utterly trivializes this game's needs, and it runs perfectly fine even with the ray tracing. Security Breach and Ruin are probably the best example of how no one sets out to make a bad game, just sometimes you get in way over your head, and also sometimes everything that could possibly go wrong around you is going wrong and it's all entirely beyond your control. I'd honestly love to see more of this particular setting. Maybe for once in the FNaF series we can play as a capable person and not just some kid or some poor schmo that took a job at a pizza parlor who has no idea what they're getting into. Maybe not like a Master Chief or a wider than the doorway Chris Redfield type who are extremely good at violence, but more along the lines of an Isaac Clarke or an Ellen Ripley type. The type that's competent, handy, and above all else is aware of all corporate's no-nos, and their punishment for that is they get to be the ones thrown into thick of it when it goes bad. And one last thing. Boomers is really cool. It is awesome, and if you ever get a chance to go, you should check it out. I've seen some of those positively insane FNaF cosplays, and maybe if everyone's so inclined, you guys might try doing something at Boomers like how all the Fallout New Vegas people go to Good Springs every year, because I think they do special events. If that somehow happens, I would personally suggest that if you do Southern California, go to the one in Irvine, which is much nicer than the Los Angeles Boomers, and also the traffic is much better down south. And with that, I'm going to give you all one last reminder for this video that we're still doing Halloween in July, present month be damned. So I've discounted the yearly rate on the Patreon as low as it'll go, and anyone who takes advantage of that yearly discount gets a cool, custom-made iron-on patch as an added thank you gift for free. And anyone who takes advantage of that yearly pledge at the $5 recipe tier or higher will get their own patron apron, just like mine, well, before I messed up this embroidery anyway, as a free gift too. I really do make all these myself, which includes shipping them because any clown can drop ship you a shirt, but I want to make my stuff special. That's why I only do it once a year. Tune in next week where I will be tested. It's gonna be wild. Now let's sign off. Remember that no matter what you do, be it playing music, making fan art, or using reverb filters to make funny memes of glam rock Freddy, what you do should never be called content. Content is a word that in recent years has been twisted into meaning a way that people can grind up all your skills, your passions, and your aspirations into a gray sludge that is meant for nothing more than mindless consumption in the name of making a line go up for some suit's benefit. Your art is a reflection of you by the very nature of its creation, and in no way do you deserve to be reduced to content. Art is sacred and it is worth fighting for, so fight for yourself by fighting against the contentification of everything on the internet. Stay saucy, everyone. Saucy boy, what you whining about? I'm trying to record, and you come up in here and start screaming. What is your deal? Oh, now you're all quiet? You're like, oh, you want to play that game? I think he might be upset that like I've got the kitchen vent fan running because I'm currently what is it? I'm forgetting the term, like when you put oil on your cast irons and put them in the oven for a bit. Oh, you know the people want to hear your meow because they thought you were a totally quiet kitty. And you're not going to give them the dignity. Not until I give you an extra snack. But you can have extra snacks. You are doing so good on your weight loss. You can do it. You can go from a chunkless to being a fine boy. Ooh. Is this actually what I have to do to like get you to be quiet long enough so I can record? Are you going to behave now? Are you going to be quiet and behave? Are you going to be naughty? I hope not.